All right, so this morning's lesson, we're kind of continuing talking about that family of Abraham, particularly Ishmael and Isaac. So if you guys remember last week, we kind of developed this family tree, or we continued to develop it. So as we had talked about, God had promised Abraham a son. And he had promised Abraham a son, particularly through his wife, Sarah. But Abraham and Sarah decided to take matters into their own hands, that they weren't sure that God was going to deliver. They weren't sure God could possibly deliver a son to Sarah because Sarah was too old to have kids. And we kind of talked about, and this is going to come up again today, that Abraham and Sarah followed God, but they didn't really know God. That's a weird thing to say. So what I'm trying to say is not that they didn't know him, like I know Mike, right? They knew of God. They clearly had conversations with God, but they didn't have a book telling them God's character. They didn't have a long history of their parents interacting with God. What they knew of God was only from their interactions with him. So when God was like, I'm going to give you a son, and they're like, sure, God, that sounds great. And then like time went on and it went on and it went on, and they still didn't have a son. So they were like, well, maybe that's not what God meant. Maybe he meant it another way. They started doubting. They weren't super clear. And, they didn't have like a Bible to fall back on like we do, right? Like where they could be like, no, God says in here that if he gives a promise, he's always going to deliver on it, right? All they had was like their memory of God giving this promise. So they doubted God. And so because of that, Sarah was like, hey, I have this slave girl. Why don't you have a son through her? Which is morally sketchy at best. Mostly it's morally reprehensible, because Hagar is a slave. Sleeping with your slave is basically rape. Because she can't say no. She can't say no, right? You are her master, and you said you have to sleep with Abraham, right? Like there's nothing you can do. If you don't do it, they could hurt you, they could kill you, they could, it's not good. Very disgusting, as Hannah's emoji expresses. So Hagar does sleep with Abraham, and she gets pregnant, and she has a son, Ishmael. This is all very upsetting to Sarah. She tries to get rid of Hagar, and Hagar runs away. Well, she doesn't try to get, she starts treating Hagar poorly. This is even before Ishmael is born. And Hagar runs away, and God saves Hagar, and brings her back. God is faithful to Hagar through all of this. But eventually, God does deliver on his promise, and Sarah does have a son, Isaac. What does that mean for Ishmael? Yeah, so before Isaac was born, Ishmael is Abraham's heir. Ishmael is Abraham's only son. But now Abraham has had a son through his primary wife, Sarah, Isaac is essentially the one God promised, God's chosen offspring. So are things going to get better? Not for Ishmael. So that's kind of where we pick up. So 1 minute, I'm going to pour myself some tea, like you do. And then we will keep going. Oh, my teapot, if you want to see it. It's very cute. All right. So moving on, we are in Genesis 21. So if you have your Bibles, please open it to Genesis 21, 8 through 14. So Genesis 21, 8 through 14. And when it refers to the child in verse 8, that is Isaac, not Baby Yoda, or not Ishmael. It is Isaac. Genesis 21, 8 through 14. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw that the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her... I think I read that wrong. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along my son Isaac. The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named for you. And as for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. Sorry, thirsty. So, I'm not particularly clear on how old Isaac would be when he was weaned. That's basically when he would stop drinking breast milk, right? That could be anywhere between like 3 and 5. So he's like a toddler, a little kid. Ishmael's probably much older at this point. Somewhere between like 10 and 13. And from Ishmael's perspective, he's just like, yay, new baby, new kid I get to play with, right? A brother. We both have the same dad, right? And so Ishmael's out playing with Isaac. They're having a good time, doing whatever it is, probably something simple. Yeah, I feel bad for Hagar too, Hannah. And Sarah sees Isaac playing with Ishmael, and she is like, I am not having any of this. That child, Ishmael, is not worthy to play with my son. But really, I think her greater concern is that Ishmael will inherit some of Abraham's wealth, and she wants all of that to go to her son. Before this point, Ishmael would have been raised as the heir. He would have been raised with an expectation that everything he sees around him will be his. And even if at, like 10, that's not really something he actively thinks about, he would be, thinking that he'll be a man like his father one day, and, he'll have similar wealth, and he'll be part of this family. And Sarah doesn't want him to be part of the family. And she goes to Abraham and she is like, get rid of them. Yeah. So it says the matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. I'm just sitting here like, Abraham, you should man up, right? Like be like, no, I'm not doing this. That's crazy. But instead he's just distressed. So while he's distressed, I imagine he's like praying to God, maybe he's not praying about getting rid of Ishmael. Maybe he's praying about like, God, I don't know what to do about Sarah's feelings about Ishmael. I don't know. But God comes to Abraham and he's like, it's okay, Abraham. I'm going to take care of it. You don't need to worry about Hagar and Ishmael. I'm going to take care of them. And I will make a great nation of him also, because he is your son. And that this is the promise I have made, that you will have many nations descend from you, and Ishmael is a part of that now. So he's like, so it's okay. You can tell them to depart, and I'm going to take care of them. So God is still going to take care of Hagar. And in this scenario, Hagar and Ishmael are older. Ishmael is older, which is the key here. It's not like when Hagar was pregnant and God sent her back. Ishmael's probably old enough that soon he can start, being viewed as a man, because back in the ancient times, that would happen earlier. Regardless, God's like, the best place for Hagar and Ishmael to be is no longer here with Abraham. And so I am going to take care of them. But to do that, they need to be separate from here, because obviously Sarah is just going to keep, making trouble. So Abraham, it says, rises early in the morning. He gives her some supplies, though it doesn't sound like he gives Hagar a lot of supplies, which I find distressing. I would have given her like a whole camel, like loaded with stuff. I wouldn't be like, well, God said he's going to take care of you, so here's a water bottle and here's some bread, Hagar. I would have been like, here's a camel. It's loaded with stuff. Follow God, right? Like Abraham. So she takes the stuff, she takes her son, and she leaves. All right. So Genesis 21:15 through 21. All right. Genesis 21:15 through 21. Sorry, my throat hurts a little bit this morning. I'm having allergies. All right. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, Do not let me look on the death of the child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the son, hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with the water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So once again, Abraham gave Hagar like a water bottle, which doesn't last long in the desert. You need like a gallon of water a day, you guys. And that's just like a normal day. So the water is gone. She's distressed. She doesn't want to watch her son die. She doesn't know what to do. So they kind of like sit separate from each other. And she's just like, I don't want to watch him die. And she prays to God and cries. And God hears her cries and the cries of her son. And he asks her what troubles her. And then she's like, I will make a great nation of him. She is transferring God is transferring Abraham's promise to Hagar and Ishmael. He's saying, look, I am going to take care of you. I'm going to make a great nation of your son. And this is not the end. And then he leads her to water, and she's able to fill her skin, and they're able to drink. Because remember, how long can you survive without water? It's only 3 days. And in the wilderness, it can be very hard to find. And then it says, God was with Ishmael as he grew. God never turned his back on Ishmael. And he flourished in the wilderness and basically started his own people group, the Ishmaelites. We're going to see them again in the Old Testament. So God kept his promise to Ishmael and Hagar. Just because Abraham and Sarah were jerks to them doesn't mean God was going to be a jerk to them. And just because Hagar is a slave and lesser doesn't mean God was going to treat her as lesser. God was faithful. God is faithful. So this kind of brings us to another topic, which is the idea of Abrahamic religions. I'm sure you've heard this phrase. If not, you will. So Abrahamic religions, that's the idea of religions descended from Abraham. So you have Abraham, and he had 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac. As we all know, Judaism comes from Isaac, right? Which, basically you can say the Jewish tradition goes all the way back to Abraham, right? Abraham and Isaac weren't really Jewish in the sense we think of Jewish because they didn't have the law, right? They are pre-law, which is actually something Paul brings up in the New Testament. But all of Judaism descends through Isaac. And then we come in through Judaism, right? Christianity, we have been grafted on, is the imagery Paul gives us in the New Testament. So Jesus is descended from Isaac, right? Because Jesus is descended from King David. King David is the house of Judah. Judah is from Jacob. Jacob is from Isaac. Well, family trees. But we, non-Jewish people, right, are not descended from Abraham. And so what Christianity allows is basically the adoption of non-Jewish people, which is us. Which is not to say that you can't convert to Judaism, because there are ways to do it. But Christianity makes it a far easier process. And of course, it's a different religion, right? And Christianity, as we know, came about in the 1st century AD. So Jesus was born around the turn from BC to AD. That's what nominally caused historians to create a BC to AD before Christ. AD is in the year of our Lord in Latin, Anno Dominium. I think that's right, Dominum. But Christianity, didn't really get kicked off till after Jesus died and became a kind of a big force in the later decades of the 1st century. And then, of course, well beyond that. So this is where we come in. We are considered an Abrahamic religion because we consider ourselves an offshoot of Judaism. I also want to bring up, so we kind of also talk a lot about, in America, people will be like the Judeo-Christian heritage or something like that. So we, as Christians, are an offshoot of Judaism, but we are our own religion, right? So we often say things like Judeo-Christian. Jewish people don't always view it the same way. they um, Christians have not always treated Jewish people kindly. I'm sure you guys know that, right? I mean, the Nazis claimed to be Christian. So, Jewish people don't always take it kindly when we lump them in with us, because Jewish thought and Christian thought can actually be pretty divergent, especially in the past 2,000 years, right? Just be careful when you say something as a Judeo-Christian thought, because do you really mean it's a thought that both Jewish and Christian people have, or do you mean it's a thought Christian people have? And even if we get it from the Old Testament and the Bible, Jewish people often have very different interpretation of the same sequence of events. Just something to be sensitive of. Right, because we want to be sensitive of our Jewish brethren, we do not want to perpetrate harmful things that past Christians have sometimes done. But moving on, there is a third Abrahamic religion. So that is, of course, Islam. Islam came about in the 7th century AD. I think it was about 600 AD, 610 AD that Muhammad said he had his vision. This chart kind of makes Muhammad and Jesus seem the same. That's just kind of a limitation of PowerPoints. I am not trying to say they are the same. From a Christian perspective, we view Jesus as God, as the Son of God, as part of God, the Trinity. Muhammad is viewed as a prophet, even by the people who are Muslim. Jesus, the Muslims also view Jesus as a prophet. Muhammad, what he basically said was that his people, the Arabic people, are descended from Ishmael, and that is what the Quran traces them back to Abraham. And there are actually further stories of there's a whole nother perspective of kind of the Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac story in the Quran, and I think there's even a little more. There's different text in the Quran about that story. I have not read the Quran. I've only read stuff about it. So my apologies if anything I'm representing is slightly off. Hannah said that Gabriel, so Muhammad says that an angel came to him and basically gave him this revelation. So the way my understanding is that Muslims kind of view it is that Jesus and Muhammad were both kind of corrective forces, that, things, Judaism, things got a little off track. So Jesus came and brought it back on track. And then Muhammad came along and he brought it more on track or whatever. That's probably a really juvenile description. For my apologies for that. Not a scholar. The Muslim people do trace their heritage back to Abraham. And that is why we get this idea of Abrahamic religions. So there are stories that are common amongst all of us. Abraham, obviously, being one of them. There are a couple of concepts that are common to all of us, but obviously all three of us also have very different ideas, right? We view ourselves as an offshoot of Judaism. We view ourselves as a progression of Judaism, right? The Jewish people do not view us as that. It's kind of like how we might view Mormons, right? They view themselves as very similar to us, and we might be like, whoa, you're not actually that similar. That's kind of how Jewish people view us, right? Where they're like, you're not actually that similar. And then you have Islam, which came along much later, and obviously has been a very powerful force in the Middle East. I think we've talked about this before, and we'll talk about it again. But both all three of these religions kind of view Jerusalem as a sacred city. And so it's kind of a contested ground. And that's why, there's a lot of politics that are very touchy in Israel that go on. And they're very complicated. And it's, yeah. In some ways, it's almost like a family squabble. But if you guys have ever been in a family squabble, you know that family squabbles are kind of the most painful ones, right? It's easier to get in a fight with a stranger sometimes than it is to get in a fight with your own family. But yeah, it's very complicated, kind of what's going on in the Middle East. I am definitely not well versed enough to speak directly to it a lot, but we do have common heritage, and then obviously all three of us diverge from each other. But that's why we kind of get put under this umbrella of Abrahamic religions. That's kind of to differentiate us from other religions that are out there, like Hinduism and Buddhism are obviously not Abrahamic religions, right? So I just wanted to touch on that, and we will keep going because Ishmael's story in the Bible kind of ends there in the desert, but Isaac's story does not end because obviously the Bible as we have it is very concerned about, especially the Old Testament, the creation of Judaism and the people who are the chosen people. So Isaac's story continues. So Genesis 22, 1 through 2. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. This is crazy. So God promised Abraham a son. Abraham ended up with two sons. He's already kind of lost one, though that's through his own stupidness in a lot of ways. God's taking care of Ishmael. Abraham doesn't have Ishmael anymore. Abraham has Isaac. Things are going great. Isaac is the son he was promised. And now God is like, hey, Abraham, go murder your son. And Abraham's like, what? I mean, he wouldn't have phrased it as murder. It's not murder. He's like, Abraham, please go sacrifice your son to me. Now, if I was Abraham, I'd be like, this isn't happening. So it says here, God tested Abraham. And we're going to talk about what that means and what we think the test is. But for now, let's see what Abraham does. Genesis 22, 3 through 10. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took two of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the two of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, Father. And he said, Here I am, my son. He said, The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the two of them walked on together. When they come to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac, laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. So there's a couple of things here. One, Abraham, some servants, Isaac, they go out, they take some wood, they're going to go make an offering. An offering is actually pretty standard. Abraham would have made offerings before. Usually you offer like a lamb, right? This goes back to like Cain and Abel, right? Offering, different things to God, your goods. It's kind of the idea of an offering can be to show God that you understand that everything you have is his. So you take the best of what you have and give it to God. It's kind of like how we tithe, right? We give what we earn to God. Offerings also had other purposes in ancient Judaism that had to do with atonement and forgiveness of sins. So Abraham has been told to sacrifice Isaac. So when they get close to the place, he tells the servants that he brought with him, Stay here with the donkey. Only the kid and I are going to go. Why does he do that? Well, I'm sure from the servant's perspective, he's like, oh, yes, this is a private thing, right? But really, it's because there's no way these servants are going to let him kill Isaac, right? Right? So then the cherry on top here is that Abraham makes Isaac carry the wood he's going to burn him alive on. Well, I guess he wasn't going to burn him alive because he's going to cut him first. He's going to slit his throat, then burn him. But regardless, it's still just like, And while they're on their way, Isaac's like, hey, Dad. And Abraham's like, what? And he's like, why don't we have a lamb? Like, we have the wood, we have the fire. What are we sacrificing? And Abraham's like, God's going to provide, son. Abraham's not wrong here, turns out, but he totally thinks he's lying. Abraham just totally lied to his son, right? Yeah, God's going to provide. It's going to provide you, Isaac. That's good. I can't even. And so then they make it to the place, and Abraham builds the altar, and then he ties up Isaac and puts him on the altar. Okay, guys. What would you think if your parents did this to you, right? Like, how is Isaac ever going to overcome this? Even though we all kind of know how the story ends. We know Isaac doesn't die here, right? But this has got to be like super traumatizing. Hannah says she'd run away. Yeah, I'd be out of there. Like, your dad just tried to kill you. I'm not sticking around. I'm not staying. Like, this is crazy, right? This is crazy. Yeah. All right. So Genesis 22:11-14. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. So an angel stops him before he kills his son. Thank goodness. Thank you. And the angel's like, don't kill him. What is wrong with you? That's not what the angel said. The angel says, don't kill him, because now I know that you fear God and you would do anything for God, right? Because you didn't even withhold your son. And then Abraham looks up and there's a ram, and presumably he takes Isaac off and unbinds him and puts the ram back. Isaac's probably like hyperventilating on the other side of the mountain. And then Abraham sacrifices the ram. And Abraham's like, God will provide. Yeah. So the lesson stated in the text is that I know now that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. So kind of the traditional viewing of this text is that God gives us everything. And it's his right to give and take, right? And nothing should be more important to us than God. And so when God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, this was a test to see if Abraham valued his son more than he valued God, and that Abraham did the right thing by almost killing his son. So that is the traditional interpretation of the text. I have recently read up on some more modern interpretations, one of which goes back to this idea that Abraham did not really know God. He didn't know God's character, right? Today, if God told you, or you thought God told you to murder somebody, you would seriously question that that was a message from God, as you should, right? The New Testament has some language in it about testing spirits. And that's kind of like, you know, sometimes you get a feeling that you think is from God, and you kind of need to take that thought, you need to think about it, you need to pray about it, you need to dwell in the scripture, you need to look at tradition, and you need to look at other people's experiences and say, is this in line with what I know about God, right? That So, today you'd be like, well, is this teaching leading me to, if ultimately what we're supposed to do as Christians is to love each other and love God, is this new feeling I'm having or new teaching that's come along help me love people better or help me love God better? If it does, then it's probably a good teaching. But if it doesn't, it's probably, a wolf in sheep's clothing that's trying to make me think this feeling is from God, but it's not, right? So if you got a sense that God wanted you to go like kill somebody, right? You'd be like, this is clearly not helping me love my neighbor better. And God directly told me not to murder. So this is clearly not from God. Abraham doesn't have a tradition or a text to fall back on, right? Abraham is from Babylon, pre-Babylon, I should say. He's from the Mesopotamian area. From his perspective, Mesopotamian gods did ask people to sacrifice their children. And you had to do it, because if you didn't do it, worse things would happen to you, right? It was literally about fearing the God you served, right? And if they asked you to do this thing, you had to do it. And it was not out of character for a Mesopotamian God to ask you, if we assume you're being asked things by Mesopotamian gods. But you know what I mean? If you believed in a Mesopotamian God, it would not be out of character if one of those gods asked you to sacrifice your son. So this whole lesson, is teaching Abraham something about God's character. And, one of the modern interpretations I've been reading has said that Abraham actually failed this test. It is a failure of Abraham to understand who God is, right? The test is God says, sacrifice your son. And Abraham did not know God well enough to say, God would never ask me to do this, and to push back, right? And so Abraham actually failed the test in that interpretation, which I think is a really interesting way of looking at the text. But regardless, this text, either interpretation, is a critical baseline text in the Old Testament that kind of teaches you human sacrifice is not something God would ever ask of you. And that was, like I said, something you could not take for granted in the ancient world. There are multiple stories in the Old Testament that involve human sacrifice. There's a story in Kings, I think, where a king that the Israelites are fighting against sacrifices his son in order to win the war against the Israelites, right? There's another story where a Jewish man sacrifices his daughter, and that story is unfortunate, and the text doesn't really condemn it. But I think the point of this story in the Bible is to show us that God would not ask us to kill our children. He does ask us to love him more than anything, but not to the point of committing a sin like this. God is not going to ask you to sin, right? God is going to provide. And this text is what basically creates that tradition in Judaism and later Christianity that human sacrifice is not what our God is about. And so that's, this is a weird story. Isaac is traumatized either way, right? Poor Isaac. No wonder he was such a weird grown up when it came to his own kids, as we're going to see later. But yes, so it seems like a weird text to us, but it really is a foundational text because we take for granted that we shouldn't be killing people and sacrificing them to God. But you could not take that for granted when you lived in 2000 BC, right? And so this is kind of Abraham learning about the character of God and the kind of things God would and would not ask him to do. And so, yeah. Don't sacrifice your kids, yo. Oh, there's more here. So Genesis 22, 15 through 18. And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you, and I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies, and by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. So this is just God reiterating the promise that because Abraham follows God, he will have many offsprings, many nations, and he will be blessed. And that is both through Isaac and Ishmael. And as we're going to see, Abraham does have later offspring after Sarah dies. So that is the end of this section. Let me stop the recording. Thanks for listening.